Here's something that might surprise you about the story of Noah's Ark. It's not an original story. In fact, there are about as many ancient flood stories as there are ancient civilizations. So what does that mean for how we read this familiar Bible story? Well, as modern readers, the first thing we have to do is admit that this story doesn't line up with scientific fact. Well, no ancient flood stories do. And there's a reason for that. They're ancient and they're stories. Now that we have that out of the way, we also need to recognize that Noah's story is a troubling story. It's a story about global destruction and divine judgment and the death of nearly every living thing. And it's a good thing if that makes us uncomfortable. I think that makes us human. See, the ancient authors weren't trying to make this story easy. They weren't even trying to make this story true. They were trying to accomplish what every powerful story wants to do, which is make us sit in the weight and the tension of their story. Because when we do that, when we wrestle with the devastation of the story, when we wrestle with the questions that the story brings up, when we wrestle with the unease of the story, something remarkable happens. We see God pivot. And that was the point of this story. The ancient people who told the stories we find in the Bible breathed the ancient air of their ancient neighbors, but they exhaled something completely different. Let me explain what I mean. You see, in every other ancient flood story, the gods were distant, and the gods were unpredictable, and they were merciless. The gods destroyed because of things like human noise, or because they simply could. And once they decided to destroy, that was it. There was no regret. There was no change of heart. But Noah's God in this story was totally different. Noah's God regretted. Noah's God turned from destruction as a result of that to compassion. Noah's God turned from wrath to mercy. Noah's God turned from ending life to preserving it. Now, as small as that shift might seem to us today, and as uncomfortable as we still might be with the story, this reality was absolutely revolutionary for the ancient people. For the first time, these ancient people were hearing about a God who experienced regret. For the first time, these ancient people heard about a God who made promises. For the first time, this was a God who doesn't just destroy and walk away like the other stories. This God, Noah's God, the God in this story, was a God who stayed involved, who cared about the outcome. This wasn't just a flood story. This was a complete redefinition of what God could be like. And here's the most beautiful thing about it. Noah's story was just the beginning. Story after story, revelation after revelation, this God gets closer, more involved, more willing to enter the human experience rather than simply just judge it from a distance. Until finally, in the fullness of time, rather than staying apart and using suffering and death against us like these old stories, this God chose to enter into human death and suffering for us. And that brings us to this thing that we call the cross. You see, the cross isn't just another religious symbol. It was the ultimate expression of what began in that ancient flood story. A God who pivots from destruction to compassion, from distance to intimacy, from using our mortality against us to sharing our mortality with us. And just like Noah's story taught ancient people that God wasn't who they thought God was, the cross does the same thing for us today. It completely redefines our misconceptions about what God is actually like. See, both stories are meant to challenge our assumptions. They both invite us to sit in the tension rather than rush to easy explanations. And both reveal a God who is far more compassionate, far more involved, and far more willing to sacrifice for us than we ever dared imagine. So the next time you encounter a Bible story that troubles you, that creates tension, that doesn't fit the expectations that you have, don't rush to explain it away. Sit with it and wrestle with it. Challenge your assumptions about what God might be like. Because when we approach Scripture with genuine curiosity, instead of rigid expectations, These ancient stories still have the power to transform how we see God. And that transformation, that's exactly what Noah's story was meant to do.